no treaty. That's what he said on the floor of the United States Senate in the prelude to the abandonment of that treaty. This is a problem, and it has been a problem for our European allies, and probably was one of the most significant points of disembarking from a policy of cooperation, because when you think about it, they really should have been clued in. Parliamentarians should have been part of a dialogue that involves something so strategically important to them, our traditional allies, our NATO allies, the abandonment of a fundamental treaty. The other issue, going back to HAARP, that was raised in the hearings was this whole issue of how else would it be used, what are the implications environmentally, etc. And you know, we were supposed to have a 15-minute presentation. They actually gave me an hour and a half to present on these issues because of the ramifications of HAARP. They later issued a report that didn't just include the ramifications of HAARP, but all of these systems associated with it, and this whole direction in technology that's taking place today, of which HAARP is just a small part. But let's get back to some of the other applications of HAARP and some of the other things that it can do. One of the other applications that came up early on was the idea of what's called earth-penetrating tomography. Let me make that really simple. By analogy, it would be like X-raying the Earth, or looking into the Earth several kilometers or several miles deep to look at underground structures for mineral deposits, nuclear facilities, tunnels, mining facilities, all those kinds of things can be detected by earth-penetrating tomography. Now, the way that this would work with HAARP is really unique, and this is again going back to Dr. Eastland's patents. By sending this energy up, this focused energy up to the ionosphere, what they can do is they can pulse the energy, so it acts like a punch. So it's punching the ionosphere with this force that causes the ionosphere to vibrate in resonance, in harmony with the signal on the ground. So, for instance, in Norway, where they have one of these facilities operating, they were able to play Wagner in a way that got the ionosphere to literally vibrate to Wagner, as an example. In the low frequency range, extremely low frequency range, the ELF range, it sends a signal back to the Earth, and ELF signals are very long wavelengths. And what they do is they penetrate the Earth and sea all the way through the Earth and sea. Nothing stops these ELF signals from penetrating. Unlike the shorter wavelengths, the millimeter and centimeter wavelengths of other communication systems, microwave systems, and so on, these don't penetrate very deep, so they can't get down to, say, submarines at depth. So the way we communicate with submarines around the planet is we use 14 to 26 mile long antennas buried under the ground that create these ELF signals. They're in Michigan and Wisconsin, and some out on the Aleutian chain and other locations around the world. What HAARP offered was a new technology that would literally change the ionosphere. By sending that energy up and pulsing it in, the ionosphere then acts as a broadcast antenna, sending back energy to the Earth in the ELF range at fairly low energy concentrations, approximately the same as what the Earth naturally produces. These signals penetrate the Earth, and their character is measured by instruments on the ground or low-flying objects that can then pick up these signals and then determine exactly what those underground structures look like. In MSNBC, right after 9/11, November 27th, 2001, there was an MSNBC report where they cited HAARP as a useful technology to use in Afghanistan for locating all of those underground facilities and the like. And the reason that they knew it would work in those applications is going back to 1995 and the congressional appropriations under the defense budget in that year. They appropriated $11 million to HAARP to test just that application under the caveat that if it didn't work for earth-penetrating tomography, or they didn't test that application, it wouldn't get any more funding. Now, they tested the application, and on a program on the ionosphere, on a show called Horizons, aired on BBC TV, a professor from the University of Maryland, Professor Papadopoulos, actually talked about the results of the earth-penetrating tomography tests with HAARP, where they were looking at underground mining facilities in the area surrounding Fairbanks, Alaska, and were able to determine with 99% accuracy the location of those tunnels when comparing them to the actual maps and surveys of those underground workings. So they proved the technology would work. If you go back to Atlantic Richfield, the oil company that started this whole project, you can see why they would be interested interested. I mean, if you get a whole profile of the entire North Slope regions of Alaska and other oil-producing regions of the world and know with certainty what's under the ground, great things for their perspective and their shareholders could be gained. In fact, an expert in this area was able to look at that idea, this earth-penetrating tomography issue, a guy named Brooks Agnew. Brooks Agnew is an interesting guy. He's a specialist in earth-penetrating tomography, and actually there's an article by him posted on my website at www.earthpulse, P-U-L-S-E, earthpulse.com. At that site, you can read the article in detail, but basically what he found is back during the 80s and 90s, he was doing work in earth-penetrating tomography for the oil industry. And what he was able to do is with 30 watts of power, which is nothing compared to 1 billion watts of effective radiative power with HAARP, but with 30 watts of power, he was able to get profiles of ground strata several kilometers deep. And he actually used this with a company that's now fairly well known, Halliburton. He went around to 9 states and 26 known drill sites where they actually knew exactly what the ground strata was and the oil and gas grades that were there. And Brooks Agnew, with his technology, earth-penetrating tomography, was able to determine with 99% accuracy not only the ground strata differentials, but whether there was oil and gas in the ground and the quality of those oil and gas deposits. That is an incredible technology, considering that the method of use was not disturbing in terms of natural systems at those very low power levels. Yet, when you think about oil and gas, those are public resources. Having certainty about where to drill and what to do would certainly change the dynamics of how the industry competitively fought for those resources, and would have huge implications in the economies of the world. But the point of the matter is, that technology is not being used for mineral exploration today. It's being used primarily for military applications, as is the case with HAARP. The question in my mind has always been, did any of these guys under any of these transfer agreements, did the oil companies retain rights? Did they keep rights so they could utilize that data in the future? Why isn't the U.S. government utilizing that data for isolating oil fields within the United States and other places? It's a good question, and one that still remains to be answered. But when you get into earth-penetrating tomography, the problem that Brooks Agnew has and others have voiced is the idea of the energy concentrations, because what he knew is that if you used too much energy, in his worst-case scenario, you could trigger geologic events, earthquakes. Those kinds of events could be triggered utilizing high-energy densities in the ELF range. In fact, there was a DOD news briefing. It goes back to April 27th, 1997, and it was at the University of Georgia, and it was Secretary of Defense William Cohen. He was commenting on weapons of mass destruction. Remember, that's way before 9/11. And one of the weapons of mass destruction he cited were environmental weapon systems utilizing electromagnetic energy for triggering earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and climate alterations. This is the U.S. Secretary of Defense William Cohen making that statement in a DOD news briefing in 1997. The idea of using energy or accidentally triggering these events was the big concern of Brooks Agnew when he started looking at HAARP as an issue. The other was, what would happen if this energy going up into the ionosphere actually acted as a conductor or formed a shunt connecting to the Earth, this energy from the ionosphere? What he envisioned would then happen is it would form a tap where the energy actually flowed from the ionosphere down to the Earth, and it would look like, according to Brooks Agnew, the biggest bolt of lightning you've ever seen in your life striking the Earth 40 times a second. Now, granted, the idea of bolt of lightning, the biggest you've ever seen, striking the Earth 40 times a second until all that energy was discharged out of the ionosphere is, granted, the most extreme of situations, and one that certainly hasn't manifested itself yet. But these are the kinds of concerns being raised by independent scientists literally around the world, and now by some of the governments around the world. There's a couple of other applications of HAARP that I want to talk a little bit about. The first one, and these are the two probably the most controversial areas of HAARP. The first one deals with the idea of manipulating weather systems. And this is a very important issue because, again, you're dealing with concepts that have been attempted over the years. In fact, these days you've actually got the United States Congress, two bills pending, one in the Senate, one in the House, to create a commission for review of weather modification technology, because commercial interests are now advancing them along with other militaries from around the world. So you've got economic interest interested as much as the military in controlling weather outcomes and climate outcomes for obvious advantage and reasons. But it creates problems, and here's what happens with HAARP. HAARP is also capable of, in fact, the early versions were called ionospheric heaters because they literally would heat the ionosphere. And when you think of this area being heated, it's about 30 miles in diameter above the facility itself. And when you heat the area up by affecting this region, you literally push it up. So it goes up and out into space, perhaps as far as 200 kilometers. Instead of being 30 miles above the Earth's surface, now you're almost a couple hundred miles potentially out into space with this column, and the lower atmosphere below rushes in to fill that space. Now what happens then? Firstly, any satellite that was a low orbiting satellite zipping through space hits this area, hits this energized area that's supposed to be there, and all of a sudden it hits atmosphere, it encounters friction, and the satellite burns up and it crashes. So as an anti-satellite technology, the Russians, through the Strategic Studies Institute in London, reported that they had actually looked at Russian papers that had a concept for incoming comets and asteroids. You know, most of these things, when they come into our atmosphere, they burn up. Because you've got this 30 miles where these objects are coming in at such high velocities, they encounter the friction, they begin to burn up and they break up and nothing ever hits the Earth. But big objects make it to ground and big problems can occur accordingly. But think about, instead of 30 miles, having maybe 210 miles of range and distance of atmosphere to break up those incoming objects. Much larger objects could be destroyed in that way. That was some of the research that the Russians had done utilizing the technology of their heaters back in the 70s. Now, that all is interesting in and of itself, anti-satellite technology, the idea of what else happens when you burn that hole in the ionosphere, is all of those particle streams, again, come in to fill that space. You know, very, very important situation. Now, granted, it's continually energized by the sun and by the activities of the planet in terms of our geomagnetics, but how long they leave it open, what occurs, those are things that are not being looked at by the biological scientists that ought to be affiliated with this program. So we really understand the implications of what's happening. If you take it a little bit further and you start to look at this whole concept of using a system on the ground to aggravate the ionosphere. Now, what else happens when that lower atmosphere rushes in? You also change pressure systems in the immediate region in terms of lows and highs and the way those pressure systems work and the way in which jet streams flow. By altering the flow of jet streams, by altering the way the atmosphere is located within an area, that's where you can get these huge, huge problems. Back in the 1977, the United States ratified a treaty where we agreed to not use environmental manipulation as a weapon of war, whether it be to create earthquakes or tidal waves or volcanic eruptions or disturb the weather. All of these things were restricted under that treaty when they involved national boundaries or crossing national boundaries. Like most U.S. treaties, the exemption is for domestic use. The treaties we sign with all these other countries have a clause within them that allows use of the technologies that might be forbidden against another country to be used within the boundaries of your own country. The Chemical and Biological Treaty is a good one as an example. Russia being a signatory to that treaty, yet they used gases within the conflict with Chechnya when they had a bunch of people being trapped in a movie theater. You may remember this. They pumped in a gas that was supposed to knock everyone out so they could go in and take care of the terrorists and free the hostages. And in fact, over 100 people died from the asphyxiation. That particular gas would have been forbidden in an international conflict across outside of the sovereignty of Russia. But again, these treaties do not have parallel legislation that goes up alongside of them that says, hey, if this is good enough for our adversaries, it's good enough for us. And really, we need that parallel legislation. Every time we sign a treaty, there ought to be a domestic law going right up alongside it. The environmental modification treaties were no exception. We continued our experimentation within the United States. The idea now that we can modify weather to large degree is something that's not just unique to the United States. The Russians, through private companies, have offered, according to New York Times articles, have offered that service to other governments to help with weather-related problems and issues. The idea also, the last 3 Secretaries of Defense, including the present one, have all called for the abandonment of that environmental treaty, primarily because the technologies have advanced to the point where controlling the environment for warfare applications becomes incredibly useful. Also for waging covert warfare. The idea of denying a country its rainfall for its agricultural production at the same time you have an embargo ongoing would be the kind of act of war that you could plausibly deny and yet have a devastating effect, even a greater effect than the traditional bombs and bullets. And this really gets into the essence of what's behind HAARP and technologies like HAARP. It's what the military now calls the revolution of military affairs, or they refer to it as a revolution of military and political affairs because of the way these things interrelate. What makes governments powerful today in the world is, in fact, their command of technology. If you look around the world, those governments with the highest technology are those that dominate the world scene. So technology becomes important for all of us to at least have conceptual knowledge of some of these projects, including HAARP, but HAARP is just one of many, many projects. And as we took this issue on, there was an underlying problem as well. Some of the things that were developed by the inventor, ideas that should be explored, were being ignored because military had no interest. A good example was Dr. Eastland had this idea that using radio frequency energy you could actually trigger chemical reactions in the upper atmosphere, which in fact you can. I mean, it's well known. But what you can do by triggering these reactions is you could actually create ozone. In other words, if ozone depletion is truly a problem, here you have a system that can replenish ozone utilizing known laws of science. Likewise, knocking out particular pollutants, again by understanding their interactions with radio frequency energy to be able to neutralize pollutants in the environment. None of these things are being looked at, and yet they offer huge potentials. I've had lots of conversations with Dr. Eastland over the years, and you know, he's got a much different view. I mean, he's a senior scientist, an outstanding physicist on the world scene. His concepts today for advancing energy systems and ways to really free people and utilize this science not for our destruction but for its enhancement. And I think that's where lots of science gets misused when those using it are only seeing certain applications. But let's get down to the most controversial issue dealing with HAARP, which is the physical effects on human health. And I want to get into the ELF effects because this is extremely important. And there's another video in this series on mind control which gets into this idea of being able to be overridden by radio frequency energy from the outside. And this is what we know from the research. If you go back to the mid-1980s, there was a document called Low Intensity Conflict in Modern Technology. It was produced at Maxwell Air Force Base, and it has a section in it on electromagnetic weapon systems where it gets into a whole discussion of what was possible. If you even go back further, you got to go back to a book called Unless Peace Comes, published in 1969. Within that is a chapter called How to Wreck Your Environment. And the reason it's an important chapter, that's before Earth Day, you know, that was later in the 70s, so you could get away with a chapter like that. But nonetheless, the guy that wrote it was a guy named G.F. Gordon MacDonald, and he was a full professor at UCLA and a science advisor to President Johnson when he was in the presidency. And he had written back then that if we could ever figure out how to electronically stroke the ionosphere in just the right way, we could return a signal to the Earth that would literally manipulate the behavior of people over huge geographic areas. That was G.F. Gordon MacDonald's ideas going back then. But in 1969, we didn't have a way to electronically stroke the ionosphere and create that kind of returning signal. Later, in a book by Zbigniew Brzezinski, it was a book called Between Two Ages, and in this book is a reiteration of G.F. Gordon's ideas about, again, being able to electronically stroke the ionosphere and return a signal to the Earth. In this particular book by Brzezinski, and Brzezinski, for those who don't remember, he later became National Security Advisor to President Carter. At the time he wrote the book, he was a professor and researcher at Columbia University. But here's this idea. Now, how do you electronically stroke the ionosphere? That's exactly what HAARP does. But what kind of signal returns is what's relevant. And here's why. When you think about energy, most energy passes through us, and we have huge amounts of radio frequency energy passing through us right today. You know that nature creates a certain amount of radio frequency energy that has always been here, but man creates 200 million times more radio frequency energy than what nature creates. So that surrounds us. We're literally surrounded in that soup, and that's just radio frequency energy. When you think of that whole electromagnetic spectrum, there's a whole lot of other energy that man's created that surrounds us as well. But the human body is really unique. It's like the ultimate tuner. Most energy passes through us like static between the stations. You know, when you're going through the radio stations and you're looking for that favorite channel, it's when resonance occurs between the receiver and the transmitter. That thing sending the energy, the radio station, to the radio receiver. When they're in harmony, you get a nice clear signal and you get your station. The same is true by analogy within the human body. And this is what the military research has shown, is that you can affect everything down to a molecular level if you understand enough about the physics of the body and the math of radio frequency energy's relationship to it. You can manipulate radio frequency energy to affect the body. And this is what they did actually in a study sponsored by the Air Force. The study was at the University of Utah. It was completed in 1985, and it was under the auspices of the Science Advisory Board to the Air Force, and it produced what's called the Radio Frequency Dosimetry Handbook. Simple language, it's the dosages of radio frequency energy necessary to override every vital organ of the body, including the brain, whether it be the liver, the kidneys, the heart, the lungs, to interfere with their natural performance as a weapon or weapon application. Now again, you're talking about energy that is different. We're talking about a whole different view of warfare. We're using energy as the base. These technologies are now being developed for things like the active denial system, which is using knowledge of microwave millimeter waves to affect the body to create pain or heat sensations, affecting only the nerve endings on the surface of the body. But these basic principles apply to the entire living organism. So Jose Delgado is an interesting guy. He was at Yale University in the mid-60s. He began mapping the human brain by planting electrodes in primates and humans to see how to affect the different parts of the brain, figure out what parts of the brain were affected and affected our, our health and the way we thought, and just sort of how the brain worked, mapping it out. Well, by the mid-80s, he had figured out a lot of other things. He found out that not only could you map the brain, but you could stimulate the brain. And so starting in 1969, he'd put the implants in, and there's a famous image of him with the charging bull, and he throws the switch of a radio transmitter, and the bull stops right in its tracks, right in front of the guy. And in this case, he used an implant that affected the bull in a way that caused it to stop. Now, what he found by the mid-80s is he didn't need any implanted technology whatsoever. All he needed was radio frequency energy, modulated and pulsed in just the right way to carry a signal. And what they found is it took only 1/50th of what the Earth's natural radio frequency energy level was to affect us dramatically. And with the case of primates and humans, making them lethargic or passive, almost asleep, to highly agitated and awake, back and forth, like throwing a light switch, on and off, on and off. No implants, no physical contact, using radio frequency energy, 1/50th of what the Earth naturally produces. HAARP, in its Earth-penetrating tomography mode, will produce 50 times more energy than is necessary to override normal brain function, according to the research at Yale University and the research conducted by the Air Force and Navy in all of those projects that we cite within our published work. Now, when you think about the idea of manipulating brain activity, you can do it for all kinds of different reasons. I mean, it can be an accidental side effect, which is what the military says is the case with HAARP. But the question of side effect or deliberate effect really takes us back to this issue of human manipulation. Is it possible? And let's talk about that a little bit more in depth. Talking a little bit more about, sort of what happens within the brain and how ELF signals, extremely low frequency signals, might interact. If you look at an EEG and you look at what the brain is actually doing, you look at those patterns, what we know is that the brain exhibits predominant brain waves during certain times and during certain activities. In your very deepest states of sleep, for instance, it's 1 to 4 hertz or pulses per second of the predominant ELF frequency within the brain. In that sort of middle stage of sleep where you're actively dreaming but you're kind of consciously awake at the same time, this is the theta range, approximately 4 to 7 hertz or pulses per second. 7 to approximately 11 or 12 hertz is the alpha range. This is where you are when you're in that zone or ideal place for learning and doing art and that kind of activity. The beta ranges get into where you're actively listening and participating all the way up to agitated states. And what we know is that any external signal, whether it be flickering light, or whether it be binaural beat created by sound, or whether it be electromagnetic energy being pulsed through the body, or radio frequency energy, all of these things at the right pulse rates can override normal brain function and change the way our brain chemistry then looks, because it starts with the energy interactions that then create the chemical reactions that then create changes in our behaviors. So the idea of accidentally triggering these kinds of events or deliberately doing it, as was discussed by Zbigniew Brzezinski and McDonald, the idea that you could literally do this and affect 70 or 80% of the population within a large area. HAARP can do this as a side effect or a deliberate effect, based on the science and research done by the military in developing these technologies. It's not one of the stated goals of HAARP, but it is an issue that needs to be looked at, and one that Russians and Europeans have begun to raise concerns about, because their research also shows exactly what we're saying is in fact the case. The problem with technology and the directions in which it's going when you consider things like HAARP is we're getting away from the bullets and the bombs and ordnance and going to energy-based technologies. Now, energy-based technologies present some unique challenges. Firstly, from the standpoint of really looking at the damage that we create, we affect living systems and electronic systems, but we don't affect the basic infrastructure of countries. We're about to spend $2 trillion in the total expenditures anticipated in Iraq alone. That is a huge amount of expenditure over the years it's going to take to rebuild it and what has already been spent destroying it. So these weapons are being developed to keep the infrastructures in place, but kill or affect the living people within these regions. So the idea of HAARP being turned to these uses in the future as these techniques and technologies are advancing shouldn't be discounted at all. In fact, it should be expected. It is one of the reasons that international bodies are beginning to complain about this technology's potential abuses. So you've got, when you look at HAARP, a very versatile instrument, from earth-penetrating tomography and earth imaging, affecting weather systems, affecting communications, over-the-horizon radar, global shielding. All of those applications, for obvious reasons, people can see strategic advantage. However, again, when you're dealing with literally connecting a machine on the ground to a component of the environment with the expressed intention of manipulating the environment for weapons applications, that concept alone deserves significant international discussion. And because it's being generated in this country, in the United States, it should have significant public discussion about the ramifications, not just within our own territory, but around the world. And that's what's missing from much of the HAARP debate. Now let's go back for a minute to the work of Dr. Ben Eastland. When he originated this concept, it was a long time ago. You're now going back to the late 1980s and the 1980s through the early 1990s. Technology's advanced dramatically since then. And Dr. Eastland hasn't just been sitting around either. He's got other projects he's been working on that are quite interesting. And one of those recently, in fact, in October of 2005, he presented a paper at Penn State on weather modification utilizing gravitational waves. Now, what's important about this paper, extremely important about this paper, is that it talks about being able to modify weather using 1,600 times less energy than was anticipated for weather modification applications using HAARP. In other words, 1,600 times less energy than was once thought to be needed. It's now understood by him as a physicist in a major university presentation to be possible. Now, when you think about weather modification. One of the other things that happened with Dr. Eastland is he was invited by the European Space Agency to do a paper on weather modification utilizing the HAARP systems. That was completed in 1999 and presented for peer review at a major space expo in Europe. Coming off of that paper, FEMA and NASA contracted with Dr. Eastland to prepare a paper utilizing space-based technologies, satellite-based technologies for weather modification applications.